Is that something under? Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Edible Education 101. It's January 29th, 2020, our second class meeting. I'm Will Rosenzweig, your course curator and guide. Tonight we begin the evening with introduction of our very special guest tonight, Professor Kathleen Merrigan, really one of the most accomplished people in the world of food systems. It's going to be a real delight to have her with us tonight. I thought I'd get us going just to introduce you to the purple of Sicily. This is one of the most remarkable cauliflowers I've ever seen. I actually wandered out into the rain in my garden the other day, and it just kind of presented itself. I wasn't quite ready for it, but it's a beautiful kind of spicy broccoli. Did anyone eat a brassica as part of their homework? Yeah? Did you cook it? How was it? Oh, Romanesco. Yeah, those are beautiful. Anybody try to find arugula last weekend? How did you do? Find it? No, you failed. Yeah, it turns out there's a national shortage of arugula right now due to climate, extra wet winter, and some kind of downy mildew, which is compromising an entire crop. Now, Kathleen told me that she had the good fortune of finding her favorite vegetable at 2 farmers markets over the weekend. So I hope you had fun with the homework assignment last night. I'm really looking forward to reading what you wrote. We wanted to get you immersed really in cooking last week, and we talked a lot about food values, and we had the good fortune of having Alice Waters with us, and she presented her vision of slow food values in a fast food culture. And you know, I've been teaching here at Berkeley for 20 years now, and the first course I ever taught was about social entrepreneurship. And social entrepreneurship is using the toolkit and processes of entrepreneurship, but for positive social impact in addition to financial return. So in essence, it's using entrepreneurship to deliver a double or a triple bottom line. And as much as Alice talked about herself as an activist and a restaurant founder, I'd like to talk about Alice a little bit through the lens of social entrepreneurship. And you'll have to forgive me, but I'm going to have to look over my shoulder at the slides a little bit because that's not working. But Alice introduced values like deliciousness, beauty, the concept of local, organic. She talked a lot about farmers, home cooking, being at the table, and of course, education. And she wove those into her stories, values being something that we care about, that we prioritize, and they become guiding principles for how we make decisions about our choices. And it's interesting to me as I think about my own personal values and how they manifest in food, I sometimes find a disconnect or conflict because so much of food and eating becomes just instinctual or unconscious even. And one of the hopes that we have for this class is that you become more aware or clear about your own personal values and how they manifest in action. So these values, if you've ever had the chance to eat with Alice or participate in her any of the meals she's concocted or even go to Chez Panisse, you'll appreciate that all of these values are manifest in the experience of what she delivers. Now, do you remember that moment last week when she was kind of holding that quiche mandarin and she said, I have a vision that every child will get a fresh cooked, local lunch provided by remember that? She sort of put out this almost idealistic, almost utopian vision. And that's really the sign of a visionary. Most social entrepreneurs come with a really big vision, and sometimes people question whether it's actually possible. That's usually the sign of a very ambitious and high potential vision, that people will actually question whether it's realistic or whether it can be achieved. Now, Alice also then showed how that vision is manifesting in an actual program. And one of the things I want to call to your attention this semester is this notion of the practical or the pragmatic visionary, somebody that walks the visionary path with practical feet. That means they maybe have an idealistic picture of what's possible in the future, but they also have a plan to get there. So Alice's Children and Farmers Initiative, which is taking root in the state of California, in the governor's office, in Stockton, in Sacramento, these are the roots that are coming together to support the vision. So Alice, as chef and entrepreneur with a strong and clear vision, she's also brought an incredible sense of activism as an educator. And most social entrepreneurs embrace something called a theory of change. This is sometimes either a simple or complex strategy about how to create change in the culture or how you're actually going to generate impact. Now, you remember that Alice also sort of played down. She said, we never thought about making money. And, I appreciate that as a value. She didn't prioritize profit, but she certainly has had to make a profit to last for 50 years, right? So a lot of ambitious, idealistic social entrepreneurs may also minimize or play down the importance of profit, but the enterprises that I've been involved in, we all end up with the same place, which is no profit, no purpose. So no money, no mission. So there's a very interesting dynamic about creating a thriving and sustainable enterprise without the restaurant to provide experiences for hundreds and thousands of people over the last 40-something years. It's provided a vehicle. The restaurant has been a vehicle for activism and education and this idea of providing a kind of integrated for-profit and nonprofit model. So Alice brings kind of an entrepreneurial and an activist root. She brings vision and a plan, and then she brings an entrepreneurial quality that is just ubiquitous, that is persistence. Some people might call it tenacity, grit. She's also incredibly resourceful. Entrepreneurs are resourceful people. They get other people enrolled in what they're doing, and then they get their resources under their control. They also are able to kind of charm you with their vision or intrigue you. Alice is often, I've watched her in action, and she'll say, I want to feed you an idea. That's what she does. I'm going to feed you an idea, and I'm going to watch you digest it. So I was just so thrilled to have Alice, in our midst last week. She's really a pragmatic visionary who has produced cultural impact and a thriving, economic source of innovation. And actually, this innovation has been documented pretty thoroughly. There's a person who I respect greatly named So Kim who got her PhD here at Berkeley in 2013. She actually did her PhD thesis on Alice's open innovation ecosystem, and she mapped all of the relationships and interdependencies between the restaurant and the foundation and the myriad restaurants that have been created, cookbooks that have been influenced, suppliers and farmers that have been either engaged or inspired, the public policy sort of movements and that have been implemented. And so if you're interested, So Kim's PhD thesis, there's also a wonderful article in the California Management Review about this, but this has actually become an engine of ongoing innovation. And it doesn't get talked about a lot, but since we're in the business school and my background is in social entrepreneurship, I thought I would just share that perspective with you. We also had Bryant Terry last week. I was really impressed with Bryant, that cooking demonstration. The first time we've ever done a cooking demo here in class. That soup was just amazing. I got some good tips on how to make a stock. And you know, Bryant, in his own way, as a chef and an educator, an activist, he's also an entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur. And his vehicle is his books. You know, we know he's got a new book coming out shortly. And he also, I think his values that really he expressed was an appreciation for the indigenous value that is coming through our food, the indigenous connection to the land, the respect for the land, the respect for the people that are farming the land, the respect for the people that have been displaced from the land, and the importance of recognizing the need to include those that have been left out of the story and the narrative of food. So he's really an important voice, and again, it was wonderful to have him kick this off. So my question to you this week is to think about, what are your food values? If you want to write them down and start to look at how they are manifesting, how they're changing. I think food values are something that certainly evolve over our lifetime, but it's a great question to kind of pose at the beginning of this class. So now, tonight, we're going to start to look at food systems. And in the last couple years, there have been a number of reports that have come out from respected international bodies that are calling for urgent change and basically recognizing the limits to growth that the planet has in the face of rising population and rising temperatures and increasing incidence globally of chronic disease associated with diet and lifestyle. And last year, right at the time we launched this class, was the publication of the Eat Lancet Commission report, and really sounding the alarm that civilization is in a state of crisis. And it's something that, for those of us that are studying the food system in a scientific and from an ecological perspective, are starting to feel. There's a lot of work being done on the Berkeley campus in terms of climate science and soil science and agricultural science and health science. And the scientific community is just unanimous about the severity and the urgency. So we've shared with you some of excerpts from these reports. If you have kind of the time and the stomach to review and read them, it's important. One of the things that I've come to learn over the last few years of leading this course is we talk about the food system, and there are many approaches to mapping the intersections and interstices of the different dimensions of the food system. I like to share some of these with you because they can illuminate how we view the supply chains, the interrelationships, the levers ultimately that are within our reach to change. One of the things that I think is so powerful and inviting about food is that as eaters, each of us as an eater, we are making choices every day that collectively affect the entire food system. Last year, we did a quick calculation on the second class. We asked the people in the room, it was about the same amount of people here, how many meals they ate a day and how many years more they thought they would live. And we calculated that just in this room alone, that the people here would be responsible for consuming 15 million meals in their lifetime. So if you think about the collective impact that's just under our power to direct, that's a meaningful force. And as educated future leaders, your ability to influence those who you care about and farther out, it becomes pretty potent. So tonight we're going to start talking about systems, and there's no person better equipped to introduce this topic to us than Kathleen Merrigan. Kathleen has occupied some of the most spectacular perches, if you will, or nests in the food system to get both a global view and a national view. She was the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, overseeing thousands of employees, billions of dollars in budget and programs. She's served as chair of national commissions. She's been a professor, she's been an administrator, she's been a scientist, and she comes to us tonight just as a special gift to us from the new Sweetie Center of Sustainable Food Systems, which was just established at Arizona State University, which happens to have been named the most innovative university in the country for many reasons, for kind of democratizing access to education, for looking at cross-disciplinary educational opportunities. And they're so lucky to have Kathleen and her colleagues on board, just like we are tonight. Please, a warm welcome for Kathleen Merrigan.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hey, y'all. I guess I have freshmen to PhD students from every discipline possible. So it could be quite a conversation. It's great to be back here at Berkeley. I've been here before. What a great school, and what a great opportunity for you all to have this class. I really appreciate Will inviting me and Alice. We had Alice come to ASU last spring, and she gave the talk that I think you heard last week. And she was a rock star. She taught me something. We went to several schools, looked at their school gardens, and I was collapsing from the heat. It was so stressful. And she was signing kids' lunch boxes and backpacks and never missing a beat. So she's really something, and you're so lucky to have her in town. So I've got a little talk, and then I think Will and I are going to do Q&A. I was asked to give you a little sense of what I'm doing at Arizona State. I thought I'd give you a few thoughts about some of the things that are weighing on my mind. It's such a critical time in food. I mean, at a crossroads, that's the slide. But you've got climate change, which is scaring the bejesus out of all of us. Diabetes, you've got the first wave of climate refugees leaving island countries because they can no longer live there in their homelands. Now more than ever, we need community-based solutions. We need to be really creative in our thinking about what to do. But I don't want to kid you, the choices that we're going to have to make as a globe are going to be really tough choices. We've got a lot of weighty things ahead of us. And we're going to need really enlightened young leaders, whether you're a farmer or a rancher, or you're just, as Will described, making some very important decisions about what you put on your plate, meal after meal. There's a lot of important work to be done. And so the Sweetie Center that I run is thinking about all these things. FYI, this photograph is Brian and Kelly Sweetie. They're down in Pacific Grove, California. They have a company called Sweet Earth that was purchased by Nestle in late 2017. Brian's an ASU alum, and he turned around and gave a big chunk of change to ASU to start the new Sweetie Center for Sustainable Food Systems. Sweet Earth is doing a vegan, refrigerated, natural, organic meal. You may have purchased some of their burritos, among other things. And now they're hard at work within the Nestle Corporation. They've just launched the Awesome Burger. You have the Impossible Burger, now you have the Awesome Burger. There's a lot of interesting things going on in the protein aspect of the world. So Will gave you very quickly a number of slides that capture what a food system is. This is one that's fairly recent. It came out from the US Department of Agriculture. The little s, food systems, that s I added because it's not that we have just one food system, there are multiple food systems. And even this fairly simplistic graphic doesn't really do food systems thinking justice. I look at that, and the first thing I notice is that the issue of wasted food is missing. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about food waste. Studies say that as much as 40% of our food is wasted. Really different when you're in a developing economy versus a developed country where that happens. Developing countries, it's more at the farm level. In our world, it's mostly at the consumer level. But there's huge implications for that. The Food Agriculture Organization of the United Nations came out with a report that said if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions behind China and the United States. So that wasted food, not only all the resources that go into growing that food, and I'm now living in Arizona, we think about water a lot in growing food. It's also about what happens when that food goes into the landfill. So that's not in USDA's chart. The other thing, I mean, I could come up with a lot of things. Another thing that's not in this chart is gender. Not true in the United States, but around the world, most of our farmers are women. And the World Bank and FAO again came out with an analysis that said if women were given equal access to education, leadership positions, they were able to have land tenure rights, world food production would increase by 30%, which is the equivalent of feeding 150 people a day. That's huge. Gender, it's not on the chart. So you're going to see a lot of these different charts, but what are we really talking about when we're thinking food systems? We're really trying to look at how everything is interconnected, so that when you're trying to solve for a problem, you understand how things are stuck to all the other things. And sometimes I talk about food systems and my students get overwhelmed because they're saying, do you mean I have to describe every single thing that chart has? I mean, Will gave you some very complex charts with a million gazillion things on it. Does that mean I have to figure out everything? No, but you have to understand where your work and your ideas, where they're situated within an interconnected world. And so that's the new way of thinking about food and agriculture. There are a number of degrees and centers like my own that are getting birthed thinking about food systems. Another way to thinking about this, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with the old blind man and the elephant parable, but the idea that the blind men here in this cartoon, they're describing the part of the elephant that they're feeling. So it's the tusk, or it's the trunk, or it's the tail. But they're not able to describe the elephant in its entirety, and so they don't do a very good job describing the animal. And the idea here is a lot of us use this parable to talk about transdisciplinary research. The idea that we need to bring people beyond their disciplinary silos, working together to think about the whole, another way of systems thinking, because that's what it's going to really take to solve the challenges of our day. This holistic assessment that's required. So I was asked to say a little bit about the Sweetie Center. I'm going to tell you my 5 priorities there as a start. I'm working on degrees. I'm really interested in next-gen leaders. The aging of farmers and ranchers in this country is pretty clear. You may have already talked about it. Average age, about 60. There's also a huge retirement wave going on in the federal government. There was a study in 2017 that found that 45% of federal employees were retirement eligible. Not clear how many of them will actually retire, but there are definitely going to be job openings in that kind of public service. We need more Aggies. Not all the people who are going to be in food and agriculture are going to be farm grown. A lot of the farms are disappearing across the country. A lot of farm kids don't want to be in farming. And we're seeing a new wave of people coming in, college educated, want to go farming. They're facing huge, huge uphill battles because of the cost of land. I was down in Yuma Valley in Arizona, where a lot of people describe it as a winter salad bowl. It's where a lot of your greens come. I hate to say to Californians that greens could come from anywhere but California, but Arizona does a pretty good job feeding the country greens during the winter months. And down where I was at in Yuma County, they were saying to me that farmland could go for as much as $200,000 an acre. Think about what the cost of farm machinery is. If you're a Midwest grower and you're doing grains and you're buying a combine, you're lucky if you get that under 250 grand. So the capital costs of going into agriculture are huge. But we know we need new young leaders of all sorts. And so I've started a graduate certificate in food policy and sustainability leadership. And I also have underway a Bachelor of Science and a Master's of Science in Sustainable Food Systems. It's really important to me that we invite in a diversity of people into American agriculture. It has, frankly, been mainly a white man's sport for my career. And I'm old, I get that. I worked in the US Senate working for Pat Leahy, the senator from Vermont. He's still a member of Congress. Back in the days when women were only allowed to wear dresses or skirts on the floor of the Senate, you couldn't wear slacks. So that's my era. But for many, many years, the only organization that I knew that involved women in any significant way in food and agriculture issues was an organization called Women Involved in Farm Economics. What's the acronym? WIFE, yeah. You go to the Farm Bureau annual meeting, and the activities for women was a fashion show, shopping, outings. And yet, most women on the farm were working the farm, and they're working the books, and they're taking many times off-farm jobs so that the family would have health care and other amenities that they might not otherwise afford. But that is just sort of the thinking. And so I've really become convinced that if we're going to change the way we think about food and agriculture in this country, we have to change the faces around the decision-making tables, particularly in policy settings, so that those faces better reflect the true demographics of this country. So part of the reason I went to ASU was Michael Crow, our university president, has inclusivity as a core value for all of us. And so I'm really trying to recruit people for my graduate degree programs, my undergrad programs, who are from traditionally underrepresented communities, first-gen college, trying to open the doors of the academy wider. So that was my first objective. The second area I'm doing a lot of work on is what we're calling true cost accounting. I don't know, true cost accounting of food, if this has at all invaded your world yet, but I've been involved with an effort led by the United Nations Environment Program that has involved 160 scholars across 33 countries, trying to figure out a way, and this is really related to the food systems thinking, figure out a way where we actually put a dollar value on externalities of food production, both positive and negative. Not because we want to argue that food is too cheap or it should be more expensive. I hear this a lot. And if you really did cost out what it really means for water and environmental degradation and loss of biodiversity in some cases, food would be a lot more expensive. But that's not the goal of this exercise. It really is to bring transparency and accountability into the system so that when decision makers are faced with choices, whether they're in the public or the private sector, they have to look clearly at what the meaning of those choices, what the results would be, and then there's a public that can hold them accountable to those choices. So we're working on methodologies on this true cost accounting. I am engaged in a research project funded by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, where we're looking at beef production systems in Arizona and Colorado, both to understand the value of different kinds of grazing enterprise for beef, but also to understand how we can do this methodology better. I think it has a lot of legs. I think it's going to be very, very important. And right now, in the current administration in Washington, we're kind of in a deregulatory craze, I would call it, systematically going across federal agency after federal agency and pulling down regulations. Some point there will be a sea change in the White House. I don't know when that will be, but when it does happen, I think they'll be looking at regulatory processes again. In the olden days, meaning just as short back as the Obama administration, when rulemaking is going through, you pass a law, and then the law is sort of the grand outline of how something's going to be, and then you have to pass a rule. The devil's in the details, and you do this rulemaking. There's a whole policy process for that, and some of you may be familiar with that. But anyhow, part of that is whatever you're proposing, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. That's not really happening so much anymore. I'm hoping now when the next time a new administration comes in to argue that we will not just do cost-benefit analysis, we'll do true cost accounting. Third area I'm working on is this idea of harnessing the power of deliciousness. Partly because that's just a cool thing to say. But I've been fortunate in my career to work with a lot of great chefs, including Alice. They have a perch and a voice that few have. And I've worked with Dan Barber, who is a famous chef in New York State at Blue Hill and Blue Hill at Stone Barns, his two restaurants, his chef owner. And he really is looking at how we bring back joy in food, how we bring back community in food, and he's really all about flavor. So these are little squash that he has bred with Michael Mazurik at Cornell University. They're really, really tasty. You know those big butternut squash that we buy in the store? They're not so tasty. They've been bred over the years to be pretty large and pretty tasteless. And Dan went to this researcher, this plant breeder, Michael, at Cornell, and said, would you help me breed for taste? Now, to me, that's a pretty obvious question. But this plant breeder was blown away by the question because in his career, he had never been asked to breed for anything but resistance to pests and disease, and for yield, how much of it is going to grow. Taste, really? So Dan is doing some really great things, and he has written a book called The Third Plate. If you take one of my classes, any of my classes, it's required reading. It's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. Best in class book about how we could do the future of food. And when he talks about the third plate, he's really talking about going beyond farm to table, taking it to the next level, and how do we get to farm-driven cuisine so that we as consumers demand food that is going to be the best for the planet. And that takes a lot of engineering, a lot of ingenuity, and there's a lot of research there that can be done, and so we're working on that. Organic. So one of my claims to fame, I suppose, was I wrote the national standards that we now have for organic food production, way back when. Still, Well, we all talk about organic, it gets in the news. You're in California, you get a lot more access to organic than a lot of people. It's still a very, very small percentage of our food and a very, very small percentage of our farmland. And so I'm really interested in advancing and accelerating the investment in organic agriculture. I think it's very, very important. It's a very holistic way of looking at production. It's not just soil health and crop rotations are the cornerstone, but there are a lot of different components. And right now, I think consumers are a little confused about what the value is in organic, because it's been decried by some people who feel that organics doesn't have the integrity it once had. And I would actually argue very strongly against that. I think over time it's had more teeth in its standards, but I think it's conflated with the fact that some companies that sell organic now are large scale. They're big business. They're what some people might call big ag. And you might be uncomfortable with that. Some people in the organic world are comfortable with that. How can, this big company with thousands, tens of thousands of employees and all these product lines, how could they really be true to the organic label? I think that they can. I've been to small operations that don't do so well. I've been to big operations that don't do so well. I don't think integrity and following standards is a matter of scale. It's a matter of other things. But I want to get that word out. And right now we're seeing a splintering in the world of organic where people are saying, I'm better than organic, I'm beyond organic, I'm authentic, I'm regenerative, and there's, let's just say, organics yesterday. For someone like me who spent a whole lot of her life fighting on behalf of organic, it's just we're almost at the point of victory, and we could lose it all. A couple years ago, the Organic Trade Association hired Nielsen to do a study of how many people actually consume organic. And they found across the country, on average, that 82 or 83% of Americans purchase organic at least once during the year. In my new home state of Arizona, which I don't think is a bastion of liberalism, the percentage is 90%. So we are starting to make a connect with the average consumer, and I think that's really good. When I started in this business, the idea was organic was really coastal. It was really white table. It was for people at a certain socioeconomic level. And I think, rather than seeing it as something wrong with the system, I see organic being sold in Walmart as a good thing, because I want it accessible to everybody. I want it to be accessible to the people who are going to white table restaurants, as well as the mom who's on SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps. That mom and her kids should have access to organic too. So I think we're at that point where we've gotten too comfortable about it and we forget the value of organic. And so the Sweetie Center is going to work on that. So I've spent a lot of years in Washington, for better or worse. And right now, we're not seeing a lot of things coming out of the federal government. We've got a few distractions right now. Some big plays going on. It's not a time when the federal government, at least, and I would say this is true mostly in state government as well, that we're seeing progressive policy, creative policy around food and agriculture coming out. We did just watch a huge motherlode of money come out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture to farmers and ranchers because of the trade conflicts we've had with China. And we had a lot of farmers, particularly soybean farmers, who weren't able to sell their goods in markets where they were accustomed. There are certain things that are going on. It's not like nothing's going on at the federal level, but it's fairly intractable. So I'm really focusing the Sweetie Center in my work in large part, and it's really great to be here with Will and his focus on entrepreneurship, I'm really focusing a lot on what industry can do, working with the private sector. So I'm involved with a couple of venture capital firms. I'm really interested in seeing all these pitch decks from young companies in ag tech. There's a lot of cool stuff going on in private industry, from the really big giants to the little guys. We had a lot of companies leave Grocery Manufacturers of America, which was the age-old trade association for big companies, in the last few years, because they said to the trade organization, our customer base is demanding more progressive policy work than you're willing to do. So there's an appetite there. And if there's any issue across the board that I see in the C-suite and in these different companies, it's climate change. That's really what is driving a departure of old ways. And food systems are right in the middle of the climate change debate. We particularly saw that coming out of the last COP in Poland, a recognition that agriculture was a huge contributor to climate problems, but also potentially a huge solution to some of the climate change problems. So it's really changing the conversation. So now a few issues that I'm really liking these days. So I don't know if you can see this in the far back, but this is Bloomberg came out with a series of maps a couple years ago on how America uses its land. And that big yellow square in the middle is cow, pasture, range, and little breakdown, sheep, goats, horses, farmsteads. This big one, I guess they told me how to use this pointer too, and I don't really remember. Well, anyhow, I'm sure. Whoops, that wasn't it. Okay, so right up there, livestock feed exports. Anyhow, the point is, this is a really revealing map. And you might argue that some experts might quibble with a few of the details of this map, but in its overall magnitude, it is very much correct. And the question that I have, with climate change, USDA has already changed the crop hardiness zones, their advice to farmers where they should grow crops based on climatic situations. Those have changed. And we have a lot of commodity farmers going under because of trade conflicts. We lost over 1,200,000 acres of farmland last year for a variety of reasons. Dairy is collapsing in this country. Is it time to rethink where we grow things? Does it make sense to grow all those vegetables down in Florida? My friends in Florida will never speak to me again. But think about the chemical intensity of some of those production systems because of that climate and all the pests that are there. So is this a time in our country where we would have, I said right at the start, maybe it's time to make some tough choices. Think about some tough trade-offs. Is it time that we could actually figure out policy ways to rethink where we grow things and how? A lot of people say we're in a protein transition. Lots of talk about alternative protein, plant-based foods. I mentioned the Impossible Burger. You've got people growing cellular meat in the laboratory. It's not commercially available yet. It costs $1 gazillion for a hamburger of that stuff. But the science is progressing. You have Beyond Meat, a company that had an outlandish IPO because people were really excited about that company and that plant-based burger. So there's a lot of stuff going on. I got a pitch deck the other day for vegan cheese. I don't know, that might be a little too far for me, but I love my cheese. But there's a lot of stuff going on, and a lot of this is because there's a recognition for human health and for planetary health. We need to decrease the amount of particularly meat that we're eating. And that was reflected in the dietary guidelines, the last two versions. The 2015 dietary guidelines DGAs. They come out every 5 years from the federal government. And I was involved in the 2010 dietary guidelines, where we sort of pushed aside the food guide pyramid that we found confused a lot of people, and instead we came up with MyPlate, myplate.gov, where that food icon, the basic message there is half a plate, fruits and vegetables. So we've got a long ways to go to get people to reduce their meat consumption, but it's starting to plateau some in this country and in other developed countries. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on. I particularly picked this photograph of roasted crickets because I'm all about insect protein. You know that 6% of wild-caught fish is, and they're the little guys, the little species, it's harvested to feed farm fish. And it disrupts the ocean ecosystem. I mean, that's wacky. That's just truly wacky, right? So there are companies that are evolving, producing various kinds of insect protein to feed farm fish. So there's this company in France called Insect, Y-N-S-E-C-T, and they do beetle larvae developed for a fish feed. I think there's a lot of potential there. My husband's a little anxious that I'm going to sneak some cricket flour and something that I feed him one of these days, and it's actually, his paranoia is justified. But I think that there's a lot of potential here. The big question, though, is you've got these countries, their economies are improving, and all the data shows that then they start taking on more protein in their diet. And who are we, well-fed, prosperous U.S. consumers, to say to some country that's doing better in Africa, you shouldn't eat all that meat? How are we going to get countries whose economies are starting to come on to think beyond and learn from our experience? I'm not sure how we'll do that, but that's going to be really important when you look at projections of greenhouse gas emissions. If we stay on the dietary trends that we're on as a globe, we're in massive, massive trouble. So we still have 800 million people, a little more, that are food insecure in the world, who are struggling to eat, and this is only going to become more and more challenging. I used to be very domestic in my thinking about my work. Is all about the U.S. I'm all about the U.S. government and Congress. That's Kathleen Merrigan. That's how she thinks. But now I'm realizing, again, putting my food systems lens on, that we're also interconnected as a global economy. You can't think that way. I actually teach a course in the summer called American Agriculture in the Global Context. There's no such thing as being a domestic person anymore. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do incredible things at a community level and everywhere else. Generation Yum, one of my favorite books. They call you guys Generation Yum. Yeah. So I was looking at data for a degree proposal I was working on just yesterday that showed that it uses some Bureau of Labor statistics. It's something that's put out a job projection by USDA every 5 years. They did the last one with Purdue. And it shows that there were 54,000 jobs within the food and ag sector for every year the last 5 years, and only 29,400 graduates with the necessary skills to fill them. So this is on my mind because we're not producing enough homegrown people to fill these jobs. Think about it. All right, it's solutions, not problems. I'm actually going to read this slide This is a Knight Foundation study on millennials and voting from 2015. They found it's best to have messages that are positive, elicit pride in the city, and are framed in how voting can positively impact issues they care about. This is what's going to motivate people to register and actually go and vote. Other lesson, people are less receptive to messages that are negative and cynical and are especially tired of hearing that the system is broken. I can't tell you how many meetings I go to in sustainable agriculture and food and agriculture. People are interested in climate change, whatever. They're interested and energized around food and agriculture. And the opening statement is, our food system is broken. I need to get young people energized around food and agriculture. That to me is a really bummer of a statement. And you know what? If you're a farmer and rancher and you're working your Budinsky off, you're milking 365 days a year, 3 times a day, and you're hardly putting food on the table, hearing something like that is fingernails on the chalkboard, because you're working, you've increased your yields, you've lessened your chemicals, you're doing everything by the book, and it's still a struggle. So Shauna Sadowski is here, is one of my former students. She now is at General Mills Annie's doing incredible work. And I'm really, really proud of her. And a really great example of various kind of job tracks you can go into, because at one point when I was teaching at Tufts, all my students wanted to go work for Waltham Community Farm. Lovely organization, but I thought, what am I doing? We're not going to change the world one Waltham Community Farm at a time. I need some of you to go and be in the boardroom at McDonald's. I need you to work at ADM and Cargill. I need you to work at General Mills. And Shauna is one of those people who's working from the inside out. No, I mention her not for that reason, but because she was one of my brilliant, tough students, and I would give them these paper assignments, and they would come at the end of the semester, and they would be brilliant problem statements. What's going on wrong with soils, or what's going on with food supply chains, what have you. And then you get to the very last page of the 20-page paper, and there'd be 2.5 paragraphs on the solution. And I said, wait a minute. I want my students focused on solutions. So at some point in my teaching career, I changed all my paper assignments that in such a way that not less than 1/3 of the paper is focused on solutions. And so that's what we need to be thinking about: positivity, creativity, and solutions, innovation, because the system is broken is just self-defeating. So we're number 1 in innovation. Sun Devils, go. So I hope that while you're here at Berkeley and in your studies, you're really going to be about solutions, delivering on science and policy and public narratives that we need to achieve food systems change. And I really look forward to the world changing in a much faster and more positive pace than you and I have seen. We don't really have much choice. So learn all that you can while you're here, and surprise us.
Over here, thank you.
Sure.
You can sit and... Thank you, Kathleen. Well, anecdotal indicators. Last year we had 160 students registered for this course. This year we have 220 plus 20 alumni coming back every week. And now we have a graduate seminar accompanying this class of transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. So our work here at Berkeley, which you know a little bit about, but it's all been student initiated. I mean, it's important for students to really recognize your role in driving the agenda at the school. And a lot of the work that I've just done in the business school over the years has been in response to people's appetite, so to speak. So I'm encouraged. I'm really encouraged by the number of students interested in this, the number of graduates each year that go on to important roles of influence. We're actually going to have a class on February 26th just dedicated to food systems change makers at Berkeley. So
Cool.
Recent grads or graduate students who are making that transition from classroom into career and to share with all of you. So I'm excited about your center and everything you're doing, and I'm hoping we can find some ways to collaborate. I think that would be great, especially around the innovation challenges. We have another course here called Food Innovation Studio, where graduate students get together and they actually work on solutions for a semester, and a number of those actually launch, they get funded, become real companies.
Cool.
So
I had a
we're just
student-
waiting for a graduate to come back with the $20 million gift.
There you go. I had a student at GW. She and her colleagues started a business called Last Call, and they got some money from an entrepreneurship nest egg that GW had, and it's really focused on hunger on college campuses, which is really distressing and real. And it's working with local restaurants in Washington, D.C. to get that food to students. But that was completely student-driven, an inspiring idea, and they're taking it across college campuses across the country right now. So just because you're a student doesn't mean you have to wait till you get the big old diploma to change
right.
the world.
I'm sure you're thinking of good questions for Kathleen Merrigan, so please, when you're ready, come to one of the microphones at the front or up here, and I'll call on you. Feel free to introduce yourself. If you're watching us online live, please feel free to send a message through the YouTube channel, and we'll get to you in a moment. You know, speaking of Shauna Sadowski, who's on our advisory board here at the Sustainable Food Initiative, thankfully. But one of the questions I always get from students is, is the destiny of every kind of small challenger, good citizen company in the world, organic company, is their destiny to be subsumed or acquired by a larger food company? And how do we see that change from within? I see you're thinking about working with engaging industry. How are you, what steps are you taking to start that off?
I've been on boards of a couple of small companies where that M&A considerations are always in the ether, but I think a lot of it depends upon the entrepreneur, the particular circumstances, the stressors. I've seen companies make decisions to be acquired because it's an opportunity to have a better distribution system, it's an opportunity to scale, it's an opportunity to have a weekend off, because some of these people work maniacal hours. But I've seen others say, no, I'm just not going to do that. And they figure out ways to raise capital and to carry on. I don't think there's one right way. I think it's really, it really varies, and for a lot of good reasons.
One of the things that changed fairly recently was it used to be a big company would buy the little company and then try to integrate its operations fully to maximize efficiencies. And there were a couple of wrong turns. I remember Kellogg's and Kashi, they had this kind of cool California vibe down in La Jolla, and they moved everybody back to Battle Creek, and they changed who was in charge, and the brand's value kind of plummeted, and they learned the hard way their value plummeted, and then they moved everybody back to California. And then when Danone bought Stonyfield Farms, they were actually a little bit smarter, and they said to the CEO at Stonyfield, we're going to put you on our board. And so, and we want to learn from you. We want to learn how you generated all that goodwill and that loyalty from your consumers. So I think maybe you can talk a little bit about this, but Shauna is kind of part of a new wave where the powers that be in the C-suite are actually honoring and listening to and respecting the kind of entrepreneurial innovation that's coming from the outside.
Well, it is kind of crazy when a big corporation acquires a smaller company because they're doing really well and they have certain attributes and consumer bases that that company wants. Then they get into the big corpus and then they start fooling around with their brand. I mean, they bought the brand. They wanted the brand. So then why does it get kind of rolled up into the big company's culture? So I've seen it work well, and again, not so well. Yeah.
We here at Berkeley just authored a case study really inspired by Shauna and her team's work at General Mills to show how a sort of small, values-driven, mission-driven company ends up influencing a much larger company. Because I think that kind of organizational transformation and how you lead that kind of change is going to be increasingly important. I mean, that's one of, I think from an educational and experiential perspective, learning how to lead change and lead in complex systems is really going to be a great opportunity.
It's hard though.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard because when you get to a certain size with these companies, they'll even, a lot of the CEOs will tell you that it's like there's a lot of inertia. And you see big companies like a Tyson's, for example, setting up their own venture capital arm because of all of this movement now in food and agriculture. Some of it's Silicon Valley money coming in and people saying we're going to bring our disruptive thinking to the food and agriculture sector. Sure, why not? And some of it is other kinds of money, but there's definitely, for people who have really interesting ideas in food and agriculture, there is startup money in ways that there hasn't been in my lifetime. And some of the big giants are feeling like they can't pivot. They can't pivot fast enough to keep up with changing consumer trends. And so they're either going to do it through acquisition or they're going to try to homegrown some of that. Really hard to do it homegrown because you've got systems and cultures, norms of the large organization that's hard to beat. I mean, I ran USDA as deputy secretary. I was chief operating officer along with Tom Vilsack, who is the secretary, 110,000 people. 90% of the employees were outside of the DC metro area. USDA is a very field-based agency. It's not a corporation, but how do you change culture at an organization of that size? One of the things that we found was that people had a lot of misinformation about organic. So we did an online training that 40,000 USDA employees took on what the basics were of organic production. But it's not like one of these things where I send out the memo because I'm deputy secretary, do this, do that, and everyone's going to say, yes, ma'am. First of all, I'm a political appointee, and so anyone just watch the sand run through the hourglass. They know the team's going to change. And so it's about captivating hearts and minds. In a big organization, doing that is difficult. So I really sympathize and appreciate those C-suite leaders when they're trying to do new things. It's not easy.
So anyone that is thinking about going into the food industry, it's a great experience to be inside a big company to see sort of how it works and where its strengths and where its weaknesses are. And I always encourage people that want to be an entrepreneur that bringing that perspective of what's working and what's not working is a great way to see where there's opportunities for innovation and challenge. Well, let's start with some questions. Why don't you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you're studying, and give us your question.
My name is John Lee. I'm a sophomore. Hopefully I'll come to Hollis one day. We're waiting on that one. Thank you for coming out tonight and for your role as a public service. My question is on the government side of things. It seems that for real change to come from the government, issues need to become electable that people can run on. And it seems that there's this huge laundry list of like climate change, the economy, jobs, immigration that just supersede food. And like, how would you go about bringing in food into like the election, right? Or like having like senators talk about it when they're campaigning?
Well, I think all of those issues you raised are food's really related. We are losing a lot of food production in this country because we don't have labor. We don't have farm labor. And more than 10 years ago, I had major California firms come and talk to me about the need for immigration reform and that they were going to start moving a lot of their production outside of this country because they couldn't be at risk for having undocumented workers and such. So immigration is a part of food. People should be talking about that. Jobs. So we said, the My Plate icon says we're all supposed to eat half a plate of fruits and vegetables. What if tomorrow everyone actually did that? Because we don't. We don't come close to producing the amount of fruits and vegetables in this country for all of our citizens to eat half a plate. And actually, over the last many years, we've been increasingly importing our fruits and vegetables from other countries. I just said to you a few moments ago, we need to bring on the next generation of farmers and ranchers in this country because our farmers and ranchers are aging. It's really hard to get into farming because of the capital costs. I'm repeating myself. But my point here is, what a great job opportunity. To me, food and agriculture, doing it well, doing it safely, doing it by American standards, which are really the best in the world in terms of production, to me, that's a jobs issue. And if I'm running for president, I just think that there's a lot to talk about there. Interestingly, in this presidential season, we're starting to hear some of the candidates talk about agriculture. And the first time it came up in the debate, one of the Democratic debates, you could have knocked me off my chair with a feather. I was so shocked because normally, because the Iowa caucuses are first, you hear a lot of talk about ethanol, corn ethanol, and what the candidates' positions are. And then you don't really hear about food and agriculture for the rest of the campaign. We heard a number of candidates, some of whom are no longer in the race, talk about regenerative agriculture, talk about soil health, a lot of it connecting it to climate change. So maybe there's some opportunity there to engage in a different kind of conversation. And I think policymakers are starting to get that young people are more interested in food than ever before. People want to know who raised my food, how was it raised, where did it come from. There's this new sense of Generation Young wanting to have food as part of identity, a caring. You filled up a whole auditorium here, and you're doing so on a regular basis to talk about these issues. That should be a wake-up call for policymakers.
Thank you. Kathleen, you and I share this connection to the Stone Barn Center, and last week I worked with 15 of those young, promising farmers who are trying to take the mantle. And one thing that really struck me was how responsible they felt for everything. I mean, not only growing like beautiful, nutrient-dense food, organically or regeneratively, but they also felt like they had to educate people, they had to, focus on food access and affordability. It felt like as entrepreneurs or business people, they have huge hearts, but also this view of kind of a responsibility of trying to do everything. And I found that kind of challenging. You look at the tech sector, they aren't worrying so much about like who has access to the internet, necessarily. But in food, it feels like there's a higher level of kind of expectation and responsibility. So how are you thinking about, helping, I guess, giving the farmers permission just to just growing good food and hopefully getting paid appropriately for it? To me, feels like a challenge?
Now, that's a big question. I mean, I've always had issue with farmers markets that require the farmer to be there. That's a rule for some farmers markets, including the really famous one in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., that many people point to as one of the best in the country, if not the world. My problem is not all farmers want to vend at a farmer's market, and not all farmers have the time to leave their operation to be vending at a farmer's market where a lot of people could take on that role. So I think sometimes we expect way too much of farmers and ranchers, and I'm forever learning from farmers and ranchers. I brought my students on a 1,000-mile tour of Arizona agriculture in December, and I didn't expect them to remember exactly what the cotton farmer said or exactly what the citrus grower explained to us or the beef cattle rancher, but what I really wanted for them at the end of the week to really understand that you cannot write good policy absent conversations with the people who produce our food. It's got to be grounded. You might disagree with what you're hearing from the farmers, the ranchers, the food processors. You might disagree, but you better go forward with your eyes open and be informed, and you've got to have that grounding. And so I'm forever on farms and ranches in my work and see the hard work that goes on there, and I don't have the courage to be a farmer.
How about a question from up here?
Hi, my name is John. I study geography at this university. I'm back at this microphone after last week. And I just wanted to preempt this question by first of all saying thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for coming here for this talk. And I think I see the Sweetie family here. Thank you also for your work and your donation as well. With that said, I think it's particularly interesting that you noted at the end of the talk that one does not have the courage to be a farmer. And it was an intense point of consternation for me hearing you talk, not addressing the serious problem of deaths of despair in American farmers. Deaths of despair in American farmers, particularly the overwhelming rate of suicides, due in no small part to corporate consolidation of means, from land, from lack of right to repair one's own farm equipment. So my question is how we can, it's kind of a twofold question. One, how do we address over corporate consolidation and then grossly unfair productive means that lead to abrogation of good practice involving the land, right, especially green practice. And then how do we ask people to be farmers, given that it's a career trajectory that leads to more suicides than abattoir workers, than police officers, than firefighters, and so on?
Thank you. Now you know you're back at Berkeley.
Only the easy questions, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, so his question is really reverberating in the room, I'm sure, because the issue of farmer suicides is very real right now. Suicides are up. I mentioned that dairy is imploding as one example. I've had a lot of friends lose their farm, and it's a really, really painful thing, and people are desperate. So it's not just about prices and markets and changing consumer trends. We also have very interesting things at play. We have land prospecting going on in this country. Farmland is being bought up, and not always by American companies or people. We've got the Chinese coming in and buying American farmland. What do you think of that? So there are a lot of pressures. I think that we have failed public policy in a lot of ways for food and agriculture. I don't think farmers should have to be in these desperate situations. I think there are ways of spending the resources that we currently have dedicated to food and agriculture in ways that would be more supportive of a variety of kinds of shapes and sizes of farms. I think having a diversity of farms across the entire country is a matter of national security. Having diversity is a matter of national security. I think that there's a lot of reasons to justify investments in food and agriculture for that reason. I'm very concerned about this new generation coming onto the land that when they hit year 7, 8, 9, they're exhausted. They've been brought into these operations with some tools that Congress has provided in the toolkit for young farmers, beginning farmers, which USDA defines as anyone in farming under 10 years. They get some of that early support, and then they're kind of abandoned. And the chances that they're going to actually go the distance is not really good. So we have some policy imperatives that need to happen. I will say that I think you all know I'm a Democrat. I go back and forth between academia and government service, depending on what team's up at bat. Mine is not right now. But the Trump administration did just come out with some rulemaking around consolidation, and that is actually a positive step forward. I can't really describe it in any detail right now. It's new, and I haven't, frankly, read all the stuff myself. I've just read the headlines. So I don't want to say that you have to wait to the next administration for good things to happen. I think it behooves all of us to get into the hallways of USDA and the hallways of our legislators at the state and federal level and make it known that there are troubles and things need to change. You're all voters, hopefully, and that means you have a voice that you can use in a lot of different ways.
Thank you. How about you?
Hi, my name is Audrey. I'm the lead food recovery person here at UC Berkeley. We work with the Basic Needs Center to get leftovers from local restaurants and dining halls and repackage those into meals for students in need. You touched a little bit on food waste earlier. I just want to hear your thoughts about how we can reform big agriculture rather than just consumer habits to reduce food waste. You were saying 40% of food is wasted, which is a ridiculous number when we have such an issue with feeding a growing population. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, there's all different kinds of things. There's pending legislation in Congress over date labeling. My in-laws are here. They're getting all kind of the family gossip here. But my husband and I actually have knocked heads before about what has to be thrown out from our refrigerator and what gets to stay. And a part of it stems from the confusion over date labeling. Is it best sold by? Must it be sold by? Consumed by? It's just not very helpful. And Shelley Pingree, the congresswoman from Maine, has led the charge in Congress to straighten that out. I think that's just like a little tiny policy fix that could be very, very meaningful. Our refrigerators are too big, and a lot of stuff gets stuck in the back. Maybe we should rethink our cold storage in our homes. The marketing orders and the standards that industry has for food means that there's a lot of discards. So it's not just consumers saying, oh, that's ugly fruit. You might have heard people say, oh, we have to consume more ugly stuff, or don't let that bruise discourage you from what is otherwise a very healthy apple, that sort of thing. Some of it is our reaction in the supermarket, and some of it is retail wanting to have completely full shelves of absolutely 100% beautiful looking things. But part of it is before we even see that produce, where there are marketing standards that people have to follow. Which means that certain fields are not fully harvested. It means some harvests go directly to landfill. And that's the kind of stuff that we have to stop. Now, as consumers, you don't see or understand a lot of these standards. One of my moments of true fame, it was in the dead of summer. This was during the Clinton administration. I'm that old. And it was it was a political summer, so it was election year, and reporters were tired of having to cover the candidates. And I was the administrator of the Agricultural Marketing Service, a USDA agency, and we put out a rule about regulating the size of the eyes, which are the holes in Swiss cheese. And so I became like late night talk show fodder, the joke of the year about regulatory mania, out of control. Really what it was Swiss cheese was not trending upwards in sales like other cheese. And part of it, the industry wanted for the grading of the top grade to have a smaller size eye hole because then you could slice it better in the sandwich slicing machines. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. But my whole point is, I'm not crazy, I'm not a regulatory maniac, that's one point. But the other point is that there's all of these not publicly visible standards that are industry driven that really need to be rethunk, and that would make a big difference too. So the wasted food problem is many, many layers. There's a great website called ReFed, R-E-F-E-D. I really recommend it because it's very solution-oriented. It has a lot of metrics in terms of what's contributing to wasted food, but also very solution-oriented. It's a philanthropic-funded nonprofit effort. But there's a lot of work going on, a lot of creative business efforts underway for wasted food. It gives me great hope. 10 years ago, you go to conferences, nobody was talking about wasted food.
We had a class in April focused on that, and Dana Gunders, who's now the executive director of ReFed, will be here.
Perfect.
So, yeah.
So now it's on the tips of everybody's tongues, and that's the first step to getting to solutions. So it makes me optimistic that something came from nowhere and it became pretty high in the policy agenda.
I really like that so much of your program at ASU's got some experiential dimension, a 1,000-mile tour of farms and ranches, going to Washington for a week. I think just in my own career and experience, you learn things out in the world that you just never get in the classroom. I think I had an experience a number of years ago where I was working with the Gates Foundation, and there was a story that Bill Gates had gone to visit some of the poorest places in Africa and was standing at the edge of a open pit latrine and experienced this sort of splash of feces on him, and he couldn't believe that people were living this way. And he made a big grant to figure out how to address the sanitation issues. So there was an entrepreneur that actually had been a microbiologist at Unilever and had been doing some work, and he actually developed this whole system for, he discovered this fly called the black soldier fly, which actually ate the feces, and then those black soldier flies became food for the fish farms. But it was such a really interesting, innovative solution that touched on all these different problems. And so, it was just ingenuity, and it was a guy working in a food company that ended up with that kind of solution.
That's cool. Let me say one other thing about wasted food, and that is just that I say wasted food as opposed to food waste. And it's just a little twist of language, but if you're a student who's struggling with hunger and you're getting help from the food recovery effort here at Berkeley, do you want to hear that you're getting food waste for dinner? Or do you want to understand that you're getting food that would otherwise be wasted? It's a subtlety of language, but I've certainly heard from people in the hunger community that little subtle difference in how you discuss the issue goes a long way. People don't want to feel like they're getting scraps off the table that were discarded that people don't want to eat. Yeah. And that's really not what we're talking about here for the most part.
That's powerful. Yeah, thank you. How about up here?
Great. Thank you. Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a second-year MBA here at Haas. When I go to the grocery store and I see like a section for organic produce and then non-organic produce, I don't really understand like the benefits of choosing organic. And you said it's multifaceted, there's a lot of things that go into it being organic, but like by my choosing an organic onion versus a non-organic onion, what benefits am I realizing through that for myself, environmental, et cetera?
So the environmental benefits are fairly well documented in scientific literature. Again, the cornerstone of organic production is crop rotation, so that you really are doing a soil enhancing, soil building crop rotation to produce the food. There are standards that pertain to animal welfare. If you're raising, for example, you're a dairy, your animals have to have access to pasture, appropriate. There are standards around chemical use, no, for the most part. So there are a variety of things. The organic standards are pretty hefty, so it's hard to completely summarize. Sometimes people are really anxious about how their budget dollars go and say, well, organic's more expensive, I can't buy it all. And if human health is a big particular focus, Environmental Working Group puts out a thing called the Dirty Dozen, where they use government USDA data, actually, on pesticide residues on fruits and vegetables, and they use that data to find out where the highest levels of pesticide residues are, as well as what you're talking about. It's really hard to scrub a raspberry. And if you're a banana and you're peeling away that thick skin, you know, there's not as much potential for the chemical to be a factor. And so they have a list of recommended things to purchase that are organic that Consumer Reports and other organizations point to as a good guide. So you can look that up on the net.
Kellogg's, I read this morning, just announced that they are going to eliminate glyphosate Roundup from the products that they're putting into cereal, sort of on their own, I guess, ahead of some other cereal companies. What do you think about that? I mean, that's kind of goes under the header of engaging industry and in leading the way, right? Because they're not regulated to do that.
They're not. Glyphosate, which is also known as, the brand name is Roundup, and many of you in your homes, you might find it in the garage. A lot of people use it as a weed killer. You know, especially like you have a pavement and you have the little cracks around it and the weeds come up. A lot of homeowners are spraying glyphosate. It's a very commonly used chemical, both in farming and again, in homeowner settings. It has been very much in the news the last couple of years because there have been some legal suits that have tied glyphosate to some serious health impacts. There's also a study in France that talks about cancer. So what Kellogg is doing is they're making a choice to not have glyphosate. I haven't read about that, Will. That's interesting. I feel sorry for farmers when they have to pivot really quickly. And if that's not being banned by the government, I would want to make sure if I were doing that as a company, I try to have some sort of humane timeline so that my farmers are not completely screwed. The way organic became really big and how we got the law passed in 1990, actually, the Organic Foods Production Act of 1990, was that there was this big outcry over a single chemical called alar. Meryl Streep talked about it on 60 Minutes or something like that. And it set off what people described as the panic for organic because of this one chemical that then was banned and nobody was using. And alar, I remember, was particularly used in apple production. But anyhow, I think we get very focused on an individual chemical, as important, as pervasive as glyphosate is. I really want to talk about overall how we produce and how we produce in a way that doesn't require all of these synthetic chemicals, because you're building a healthy, diverse ecosystem that doesn't need those kind of crutches. So I'm interested when people have these individual actions on chemicals. I'm much more interested when it's more of a systems approach. Are we talking about food systems? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. How about you?
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a sophomore right now studying conservation and resource studies with a focus on sustainable agriculture and food systems. And I really loved that you brought up the whole aging farmer population problem, and that the average farmer is now 60 years old, and that women can, and the issue of diversity in farming. But I was wondering, what are the efforts out there right now that have to do with getting farm workers into the position of owning land and becoming farmers themselves?
Yeah, that's not very high on the agenda. Farm workers, by the way, a lot of times I hear people talk about unskilled labor as it relates to farm workers. And if you are out in the fields in Yuma County, Arizona, or if you're in the fields in California and you look at how these folk work and the techniques that they have, I would say, first of all, if I had their jobs, I probably wouldn't have any fingers at this point, because what they're doing is very dangerous and highly skilled and not very well respected. If you're down at the border of Arizona, buses come across the border about 4 a.m. every morning with farm workers coming to harvest in the fields. It's a really hard life. We don't have adequate housing, healthcare, security. I mean, the list is, we have got farmers who aren't doing well, they're committing suicide. We have farm workers that aren't really being treated well. But I keep going back to policy because that's my thing. And we get very focused on a farm bill, and that does the bulk of our food and ag policy. Every 5 years or so, we pass a farm bill. But our energies shouldn't just be focused on farm bills. There's a lot of stuff we could do in the tax system. Why couldn't there be different tax policies that promote a sweat equity arrangement between a farm owner and a farm worker or a young farmer, so that that farm eventually is owned by the next generation, and that next generation is being trained along the way? Because if you didn't grow up, you're not homegrown on the farm, there's an awful lot to learn. And not everyone can afford to go to apprenticeship to apprenticeship to apprenticeship, not really earning a living wage. So I think that there are a lot of policy tools, again, that we could explore to address some of these things. We just need policymakers with an appetite for it.
Do you think that's best addressed on a local or state or federal level, or some coordination of those parties?
I think it can be done on any level. I mean, Santa Cruz, I was in a meeting last week where we were talking about rights of nature doctrine, an evolving legal doctrine looking at, does a river have intrinsic rights to exist? It's a little out there. I'm very interested in it. But Santa Cruz, as a municipality, has done some stuff around that. California is really important as a state in this country, as you know, because it pushes the margin out there. I'm doing a research project on organic with NRDC, National Resources Conservation Council, and Californians for Pesticide Reform. So we count on California to do progressive things, and you have a great Secretary of Agriculture in this state. I think that's really important. So every level of government people should be looking at. There's opportunities.
And guess what? The Secretary of Agriculture will be here in a couple of weeks to talk to you too. So it's going to be quite a semester. Thank you, Hannah, for your question. How about up here? A couple more. Probably have time for one or two more. Get to you too.
Hi, my name is Russell. I'm a nutritional science second year. You mentioned the Choose My Plate revisions, and Marion Nessel a while back mentioned that produce, especially fruit and vegetable farmers, don't work or don't cooperate with each other as much as, say, meat and dairy industries or even grain. Have you had any experience in this, or what do you think some solutions could be, either on a government level or on an individual level?
Well, I wasn't here to, I wasn't able to hear Marion talk. We're friends, so I can't really speak to that. I do think that there's a lot of cooperation in fruits and vegetables. There are marketing and promotion programs for a lot of these different industries, Hass avocados. Every industry has their own boards and advisory groups, and it's not my perception that there's less cooperation among fruit and vegetable producers than livestock, for example. I do think, though, that we overlook the value of cooperative structures. And there's been a long history in American agriculture for worker ownership or cooperatives. Organic Valley, based in Lafarge, Wisconsin, is over $1 billion co-op now that does organic. Now that is mostly dairy, but they do beyond dairy. That cooperative structure is a way of farmers and having more control and having a piece of a pie. And the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is a great organization, and they have some history about cooperatives on their website. That's a very important organization for black farmers historically. And you have the National Cooperative Business Association. For those of you who are studying business and you're thinking about food and agriculture, look into the cooperative history here. In California, Del Monte was a big cooperative. So there are a lot of different ways of organizing, and cooperatives as a structure, I think, have a lot of appeal.
Thank you. How about one last question here?
Thank you. My name is Karina. I am a master's student. We have a Master's of Development practice program, which is focused on sustainable development. Question again about organics. My understanding is that sometimes organic practices aren't necessarily best for the environment with regard to greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm wondering if you see that as a dichotomy, and if you could speak to that, if you believe it exists.
Again, I'm not sure the specific of the critique. There is some concern that organic farmers till the soil. This could maybe be more about livestock. I'm not sure what that is, but I will just expose one of the current debates around organic anyhow. And that is that for weed control, rather than using an herbicide, a chemical, a lot of organic farmers are doing some tillage. So some critics say, well, you're disturbing the soil by doing that tillage, and it would be healthier if it was left alone. That's been one of the things that has been part of the discussion around some of the genetically engineered crops, that they've been genetically engineered to resist herbicides. So Roundup, glyphosate that we were talking about earlier, you would have a soybean, for example, that's been genetically engineered to resist that herbicide. So you can put that herbicide on, and it doesn't hurt the crop. It kills all the weeds around it. And you don't do any tillage. You don't disturb the soil. And some people will argue that's a preferable system to an organic system where you have some tillage. There are people who want to develop a standard for regenerative agriculture. And one of the things I've heard, one standard is, well, you can't do deep tillage. I asked, what's deep tillage? Well, that's 8 inches. You can't go down 8 inches. But it's an across-the-board standard. It's like, well, does it matter what the climatic conditions are, what kind of soil it is, what's being produced? Well, haven't gotten to that level of specificity. So I think this issue around soil health and tillage, I could get 2 incredibly brilliant, respected soil scientists and put them in front of this class tonight, and I think we could have a healthy debate on that, somewhat unresolved. But I don't really associate organic with greater greenhouse gas emissions than other forms of agriculture.
That's a wonderful segue, because next week we're going to actually have one of those soil scientists here, Wendy Silver, who is a professor here at Berkeley, one of the world's experts really in soil science and studying these systems of tillage and carbon sequestration. And So next week, the class is going to be about sort of the how, what, and why of soil science and regenerative and organic agriculture. And we'll have Dr. Silver, and then we'll have three farmers, two farmers and one rancher who are actually working with these processes. So it's a great follow-on to your final comments. And
that's the big excitement for the future, right? Farmers are really hoping that we'll develop ecosystem markets and they'll get paid financially for the soil for the carbon sequestration in soil. So you'll have a great class next week. That's the future.
well, we're grateful you're here, and we're grateful you're back in the educational sphere, even temporarily. And let's have a big hand for Dr. Merrigan. And Allison, I'm going to ask Allison to come up, and we're going to take a quick poll for the students. Take out your cell phone or your device. We're going to do Kahoot now. And for those of you that read the climate communications report from Yale, they had a couple of interesting questions, and we wanted to benchmark Berkeley's perception versus
Is this
the
the Six
national.
Americas?
Yeah.
I know that study.